Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Garden Cinema. Thank you very much for joining us for this industry, what are we calling it? Industry panel networking event. It's the third one we are hosting. The first one was about feature film producing, and the second one was on festivals and how to get your film into festivals. This one is a bit more niche. It's about documentaries. So I'm very pleased to see there's quite a few of you that are interested in this subject matter. And I'd like to welcome our guests who have very, very, very nicely agreed to come and share their expertise. It's documentary filmmaker Edward Lovelace and head of theatrical sales at Dogworth, Tom Howson.
Hello.
I won't be speaking that much because the whole point is to get you to ask questions, comments, anything you're interested in, and for our guests to share as I said, their expertise and anything they want to share about the world of documentary filmmaking. So I just want to
scary pressure on us, Tom.
We're
doing all the talking.
Absolutely
very
terrified.
Very informal.
Found out.
I'm going to start off with some very basic questions, just so we're all on the same page. I'd like to ask you about your respective jobs. So first of all, Tom, what is a head of theatrical sales? What do you actually do practically?
So my job at Dogwoof is to, when we've taken on a film or when we're assessing a film to take on, my job is to consider whether or not that film is theatrical or not, which means does this have a place on cinema screens as opposed to simply in people's homes, and then go through the rather laborious process of sort of presenting that film to cinemas, exhibitors, programmers, and trying to give it the best possible platform for audiences in cinemas.
So presumably that's, as you've only mentioned cinemas and theatrical sales, that makes sense. Is there anyone at Dogwoof that would then be in charge of distribution and sales to other platforms such as VOD or anything else, TV and so on?
Yes, we have a head of home entertainment as well who will, typically most of our films will get released digitally in some form, sometimes even physically on Blu-ray and DVD, still happens. And more often not, these days it will be day and date with a theatrical release, so you can go online and see it at the same time. So we sort of take that decision collectively as to if we're going to do day and date releasing or not. Sometimes we still have a short theatrical window, sometimes we have a very long theatrical window, which still remains a bit of a hot topic in distribution. But yeah, there are a number of different people at Dogwoof who each have different sort of specialities, but we sort of all come together as a team and make some of these bigger decisions.
And would you say that Dogwoof as a distributor has a type of documentary that they tend to specialise in or distribute or like to receive? Or is it pretty much anything that you would qualify as a documentary?
I think we'd be pretty loose with our definition of documentary even these days. We are strictly documentary, but there are things within that definition. We were looking at a film the other day which was just a straight up concert. It was just a singer singing on stage. And we had quite a long debate about whether this was a documentary or not. But in the end we decided, it's non-scripted content. But there's no typical film that we would take on. There are films that we might rush to a bit more quickly and say, yes, this has to happen, and ones that we might be a bit more tentative about that can really divide opinion. But if it's a doc, then we'll look at it.
And do documentary filmmakers just approach you, or do you scout films?
We
at
scout,
festivals
but typically projects are brought to us, or we go to festivals and look at everything that's available and weigh everything up. We look at a lot of stuff. We have a weekly meeting as a team and go through very long lists of we watch a lot of documentaries.
Yeah, can imagine. Thank you very much. Ed, how about you? So you're a documentary filmmaker. Is that what you don't make fiction? That's what you would call yourself now?
Yeah, I mean, I have made fiction and still write fiction, but yeah, basically my day to day and the thing that I really am passionate about and want to carry on doing is writing, directing documentary, basically. And I guess I see documentary definitely as this limitless thing. With this last film I just had out, I've been talking about that kind of concept a lot of I think in fiction movies we all are excited about the fact that there are all these genres and you can make a load of different types of films, and and the audience are wanting you to step outside of the genre. You know, it's a horror film, but what's cool about it is actually it does something else at the same time, or it's a drama but it's got a horror element, or whatever that is. But in documentary, I think people, which is interesting, is you talking about that time about what is a documentary. I think people can get quite hung up on like what the form is basically, and like you kind of get these, you know, documentary, like, you know, police people who are like really, you know, is that going by the rules of documentary? My thing is like, if you're telling a real story and the storytellers are real, then I am wanting to watch documentaries where the filmmakers are like, my ambition visually and storytelling wise is as ambitious as fiction filmmakers. So yeah, and I guess what my job is like finding subjects that I really care about, and then spending a load of time connecting with contributors and making them sort of my family, so that when I go and make a film, not about them but with them, that trust is there and it feels like we're doing something together. That, you know, if you're gonna take someone's life and put it on screen, that sort of trust and that whole thing matters a load to me. So that ends up being a load of my job.
And am I right in thinking that you also get commissions now? It's not just about subject matters that you're particularly interested in, and then you go out and you film and you try to find the funding, etc. But people have, or institutions have, approached you to say, can you make a documentary about this? Yeah,
it's often like producers sort of have the, like, you know, everyone now is obsessed with like the IP, as in like they have like the right to something, but often that means a producer has connected with, they've either like unearthed a story themselves, or maybe a production company, their development team has found the story and got a connection with the contributor, and then now they're looking for directors to sort of like come on board and add their vision to it and kind of bring it to life. Or, you know, or it's like an icon, it's like a producer, it has spent 3 years with like an icon, basically like a person who we all know about, and they've been figuring out how to tell their documentary, and then they might come to me. But I guess my filmmaking style maybe is specific enough that I say like most of the projects are sort of coming from me, so it's a lot of like unearthing your own stuff, which is like, you know, painful and takes lots of time, and the idea of being offered a project from someone else who's like, I've done all the work for you, like I've spent 3 years, like, you know, finding it and gaining the trust of the contributor, and like kind of writing the story, like finding the arc of the story. That sounds really lovely, because then you kind of go, oh, my job is literally just directing. But more often than not, it doesn't quite work that way. And if you're going to come on and direct a film and say, this is mine, I'm the director, you're going to end up having to do that stuff, even if it comes to you a little bit more fully formed than just you reading an article online and then kind of going down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, it makes sense. Thank you very much. I'm aware that some of you might already have questions. The first one's always the hardest to get across. Oh, we've had one hand and then you. We do have... we have a roving mic.
We can repeat the question.
Yeah, we can repeat it.
Okay. First, I adored your film. I saw it at the NFT and I just was in tears and I loved it. And I know a Kurdish family from Iraqi Kurdistan, very similar ages, and the whole thing made sense to me. My question is really about exploitation of the subject in a documentary, which, I mean, I'm sure you'd like to say more about how you got to know the family, and you didn't film, I think, for 2 years before they trusted you and stuff. Whereas I've seen other documentaries, like one, I can't remember the name, but on Naples, and the guy filmed these street kids who have nothing going for them apart from, like, you know, rummaging around the streets and so on. He made this brilliant documentary, and we asked him afterwards, so what's the follow-on? Did you do anything for these kids? Did you try and help? No, you know, it's a film finished kind of thing. So that for me is exploitation of the subject. And another film which you may know, made I think by a Danish filmmaker, about a street seller in Chile or something, with this kind of little bent, what do you call it, you know, thing that he... Cart, thank you. And so at first it's all amigo, you know, my best friend and so on. Then at a certain moment in the filming, the guy says, I want more money. You need to pay me more money. So they're not really friends. So the whole thing about how you treat a subject as an object that you're going to make a film on, or how you really develop a genuine friendship, for me, it's really interesting. If you could say something more about that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, I think the two things to say about documentary now is that like it's like a business basically, you know, as in like since streamers have figured out that audiences love documentaries, there's a load of like, you know, streamers are obviously, think about how many development teams there are like being told you've got to come up with an idea by Friday kind of thing. So obviously like there's money to be made, I guess, in terms of that world. So obviously that means that more stories are going to be unearthed, and like is every story being unearthed by like an individual, but is it rather being unearthed by like a company? And I think then do you definitely know if it's 25 people unearthing it, do you know there's that person, like, do you know the contributor is going to be in sort of safe hands basically, because it's a sort of, you know, because there's a business behind it. That's the first thing. The second thing is I think contributors also know now that the documentary is a business, and they're like excited about like, oh well, if the film gets sold, and I don't know how other people work. I've always thought, which is something I'm 1,000% loyal to, that a rule of making documentary is like your subject can, you know, there can be no payment to the subject. The subject has got to want to make the film and tell their story basically. I don't know if that's what everyone else is still agreeing on, but I think the idea that people kind of think, oh wow, it's worth me making this film because I'm going to sign a contract, and if it gets sold at the end I'll make some money. So those are like, I guess, new things that everyone's trying to navigate. For me personally, and I'm just like one person, maybe, you know, I'm sure there's a load of people like me, but it's easy for me to like kind of get my head around those sort of moral issues, because I'm always just like, basically I'm like, let's make a piece of art together which is like an extension of you, and if you could imagine what your story would look like, you tell me what that is and I will try and make that with you, not for you, not outside of you, but literally with you. So we are making this together basically. That makes the moral issue like really simple for me, because then you're it's only ever going to go ahead if you're getting not just like okay, I agree to it, but actually people are like, this becomes a really big part of their life basically. That makes it harder to make a load of films, because it just like takes time, and that's just something that just like matters to me. So this new film I'm making, I'm now, you know, have been doing the same kind of like groundwork, and I think the subjects that I'm making this new film about, they're like texting me saying like, Ed, there's this thing happening, like, should we go film it? And I'm like, let's just wait and wait. So when we film, we've genuinely got that trust, and, you know, and if I'm comfortable with it, you know, like, let's just wait as long as we can, so that when we're making it, there's a genuine sort of friendship and understanding there. But yeah, definitely, yeah, it's like, you know, if you watch a load of documentaries on Netflix, you're watching them thinking, I wonder if people knew that their story was going to be depicted in this way, maybe. So yeah, I can only speak to myself, but yeah, that's definitely like a new thing.
Have you seen the documentary called Subject?
No, I've only seen Lawand.
We released it back in March, available now, dogwoofondemand.com, which addressed this issue specifically. A couple of filmmakers went back and re-interviewed people who'd been in notable documentaries over the years and how it had affected them. A lot of them were deeply affected by it and sort of resented the fact that these people had come into their lives and filmed them and then just exited. And one of them, Margie Ratliff, who was in The Staircase, which was a famous documentary that eventually ended up being a Netflix drama, she served as an executive producer on the documentary and sort of reclaimed the story for herself, and came over and did a bunch of Q&As. I would recommend checking it out if it's a subject that interests you.
Is that you're still friends with the family, aren't you?
Yeah. I mean, I'm like only ever going to make films where I just kind of make this like lifelong commitment, basically. And I think if anything, I don't know, we're speaking about this film that I just finished called Name Me Lawand, about this kid and his family from Northern Iraq who ended up in the UK. The kid's deaf, and it's all about him learning British Sign Language in the UK and then sort of fighting the Home Office in order to stay here. But yeah, I hope Lawand, you know, still wants me in his life when he becomes like, you know, a teenager and is in his I mean, the last time I saw him, he already got his like teen swagger on, and I was like, oh, I'm suddenly like not cool enough to be in the same room as you. But yeah, that matters. And then the previous one I made about Edwyn Collins and his wife Grace, I mean, that's like, yeah, these are just like lifelong commitments that you make, basically. Even when I made this short doc series for Scott Atlantic, and the people that we made the films about, I think when we came back and visited them, they like lived in various places in Europe. They were so shocked because they were like, oh, we thought, so, you know, it was hard to know whether your promise of like, we'll come back was totally true. But yeah, so I don't know how other people do it, but I only know how to do it that way. Yeah,
surely leads to a better quality film overall.
Definitely, yeah. And also, I think the idea, I've been saying this recently, I think when you're like a younger sort of director, writer, especially a director on set, you're really encouraged to, like, you know, the role of a director is to be really decisive, to really know what the answer is. There's just going to be this big team of people there, and if they all turn up and like the captain of the ship doesn't know which way they're going, everyone's just going to be like, this is a disaster. And so you put lots of pressure on yourself to sort of own the choices. And in my younger years, people being like, you know, you don't have to share the vision with everyone as long as you know what it is. I think as I've got older, I'm like, I don't know whether that's totally the right, I don't know if you get the best end result by being that sort of exclusive with your thinking. So the last couple of films I've made, I've been way more like, you know, this isn't just a collaboration with the subject and me, but and the producers and everyone here. Like, who's to say I know the answer more than Lawand? And Lawand's ideas, I think Lawand had all these amazing ideas, and I was just like, we're just gonna visualize them for you, basically. So yeah,
it really comes through the film. Thank you very much, and that's a very good question. I did think of subject as soon as you said that. It's very, very good documentary as well. Yeah, thank you very much. I saw some. Yes, if you want, that's great. You get the remote, the roving mic. Thank you.
The first one's for Tom. What do you rush towards? And what do you weigh up? What are you weighing up when documentaries come your way? And the second one is for Edward, which is, do you find that you get paid now that you've had success? Because those documentaries take time. They take a lot of unpaid work. And I know a lot of very young and elderly documentary makers who are struggling with 2 or 3 jobs just to make the time to make the documentaries they want. So I'm interested in, has the dynamic, given that it's more of a business, changed since you've had success?
Tom, do you want to answer that first?
Which films do we rush to? Yeah, so there's this question of is this film theatrical or not, and broadly there are sort of 2 categories within that. The first is usually something that's on a topic that people are already fairly familiar with and really want to sort of lean into again and revisit. The typical example would be a music documentary about a band that somebody knows and loves, and even though they've seen every concert video, they've listened to every bootleg, and there's not going to be anything fresh on screen for them, it's still a chance to sort of bathe in that nostalgia for them again. Those can just be a total no-brainer. There's a sort of spectrum within that as well. And then secondly, theatrical, something that just sort of belongs on the big screen. It just is big and cinematic and needs to be seen in that way. There's a film last year called Fire of Love, which we did with National Geographic, which on paper you wouldn't necessarily say is a big theatrical success. But then when you just see the visuals, it belongs on a big screen like that. And it got harder and harder to not think of it in any other way. In terms of what we might rush towards on a sort of more general scale, you can be wary of things that are a bit too niche, and that films that are, albeit sort of painfully beautiful, could be hard to bring to a sort of a wide, broad audience. We've certainly released films that have been unanimously loved by the entire Dogwoof team, but have gone on to do very, very limited success and not really delivered, and ended up being a bit of a sort of loss-making exercise for everyone involved. So typically it's about, primarily the subject matter is first up, but if something is just so richly visual that it belongs on screen, then it becomes a no-brainer.
Thank you very much, Ed.
Okay, I've got the tough question about money.
It's more about survival in order to make this stuff.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Because of the way that documentary is changing, and you have this huge end. At one end, I've worked archive on a documentary, The Deepest Breath, that came out on Netflix, massive money. And then at the other end, you're struggling just to pay bills and to get the documentary actually made and make sure everybody can eat.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if that's changed, given that your film, The Wand, came out sort of more or less in the middle of that change.
Yeah, I mean, I think first off, I think the kind of what's so great about documentary and sort of like it's at the heart of it to me anyway is its job is to show us stuff that obviously first off I love documentaries about bands that I love, that I've seen everything anyway, but of course that's what a great film does, isn't it? It brings together something that we all know and then we get to enjoy it for 2 hours. But I think obviously like I guess the documentaries that make me, you know, give up loads of my life in order to make them is because I feel like this story isn't being told by anyone else and the world would be a better place, or we would have more empathy if we saw this story. And I think like often those stories sort of aren't pitchable, you know, as in like when I was pitching Lawand, like as if anyone was going to go, so there's a kid that no one knows anything about and you don't know how the story ends and, you know, all these unknowns. But the subject sounds worthy at the beginning, and obviously I guess my job as a documentarian is to like ensure that those stories are exactly what Tom was saying, basically are like whatever the word is, like cinematic enough, universal enough that a load of people are going to see it, and then they can be a success, so that then the next time you make a film you're going to have to ask for more money to basically be like, we've all got to get paid to live, to keep on doing this. But basically that's just like hoping that, you know, the Doc Society, if anyone knows Doc Society, they're an amazing like company based in London who, you know, fund documentaries, and they're funding you like they're like a streamer, as in they're like your execs, they're totally involved with you, but it's a grant, so they're giving you all the money to make the film, but they're sort of saying there's no contract, you don't have to listen to us. Once you give you the money, you're just off on your own. And their like remit isn't like, please go and have a big hit success. They're just like, we care about the subject and the way you're telling it, just keep on doing what you're doing because this is important. Obviously no one else operates like that. Streamers are like, you know, they think that if no one sees it, then it's a failure kind of thing. So I think I'm trying to kind of figure out a way of staying true to those films that I believe need to be told, and the world would be a better place if they watched it, but trying to figure out a way of convincing someone to give us the right amount of money that everyone can, you know, that it's a shame basically when people work on documentaries, they're like sort of, that's when they're working for free and doing you a favour, but then the thing that we're making is the most important thing to all of us, but it's the one thing that you're missing your kid's birthday because it's a Saturday or whatever it is, you know, you're sacrificing because you're not getting paid properly. So and yeah, after like I made Lawand in a way that I was like, I can probably make one of these films like once every sort of 10 years the way I made that, just by totally, you know, spending 2 years in Derby, like immersing myself in the deaf community, learning sign, not wanting to pitch the film out to anyone because I didn't want to have that conversation with Lawand's family of like, oh, we're now writing like a sort of, we're now putting together like a deck about your life. I just wanted it to be totally pure, and I was just enjoying doing it and didn't care that there was no money behind it. And when we got finance for that film, it was like, well, we could just make the money just from a few financiers who really believe in this, and obviously if we go and get a really great streamer like Netflix involved, are they then going to want to change it? And then suddenly my promise to all these people about the fact that we're making it together would be broken, because I'd be like, well, a streamer now owns us, so they're going to decide they're going to change it. So it's a tricky thing, but I think the cool thing about all these streamers and all these new platforms and all these like hundreds of new documentaries being made, my gut says that if filmmakers figure out a way of making stories universal enough, filmmakers can do it and make money basically. But yeah, the whole money thing is like an interesting one, because obviously the pure of the film is going to be one that you're self-funding, isn't it? Because then no one's going to tell you what to do, so it's always compromise basically.
Thank you. I hope that answers that to a certain extent. Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions in the audience? Yes. Oh, two. Gentleman there and then behind. Thank you.
I want to ask about what do you think about films that are for a niche audience, film that aren't really interesting for the masses, for the broad audience, but they have a group of people that would really want to see them on the big screen. Do you think these smaller films that do have any chance of success, or is it just, or the big screen just belongs to the ones that can please everybody at the same time?
It's a good question. I think there's always a way to a theatrical if you can justify it, but the costs are pretty extreme. We've had examples in the past of films that we kind of underestimated and didn't realize how big a pool of audience there might be for something like this. But you need to sort of be able to define it a little bit. I don't want to sort of just use lazy examples, but we did one recently about a cyclist, an American cyclist, who competed in the Tour de France. And we totally underestimated how the UK population of cyclists would turn out to see a film in the cinema. So in a sense, there is an inbuilt audience there ready for that. It might have seemed a bit niche, but actually they're all there and ready. It gets more difficult when you're just talking about the sort of universality of the story that's being told about one person or a collection of people. You really need the film to be pretty special and pretty amazing to justify the amount of money you're going to have to spend just to get it released on the most basic level, by which I mean sort of 5 to 10 cinemas screening it for a week. If you can get some support from somewhere, like the BFI or some other outside investor, then there's usually a way to it. Sometimes the streamers, Apple, Amazon, they've really got their eye on winning an award. So they're happy to put money into something with no real intention of getting any theatrical box office back, but hoping to just develop the prestige of something to the point that it might win an award, and that makes them look better. Sorry, I've sort of gone off the point a little bit about your question.
No, that's great. I just want to ask also, do you know if there is a good way to find which audiences will be interested in these niche films? For example, cyclists, is obvious they're going to like that. But do you ever see like a film that you're like, we don't know who might like this, nobody might like it, but then a group of people come around and they really love it? And is there a way to find that group, that audience? And is there a way to target them in marketing and everything?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little tricky because sometimes you see a film that's completely singular and you've never seen anything like it, and you're like, well, we can't compare this to anything that's come before, so we can't just say, well, there is an audience for this because look at X, Y, and Z film that happened 5 years ago and 10 years ago, so let's just do a repeat of that. In the cycling world, there had been some other titles that had performed pretty well, and we thought, okay, well, we can be a little bit confident at least. But every now and then you get something that comes along and I can't think what to compare this to, but it's a great film, so let's try it. If there is an audience you're aware of, you can look at social media, you can look at sales stats, literary sales, that sort of thing. Discover is there a bigger pool of people interested in this specific topic than we realized, and try and reach them. But it's very, very, very hard to reach them a lot of the time. You can put lots and lots of money into marketing, but it passes people by. You have to be pretty targeted, and it's very hard to be targeted. Which she'd never heard of our film Subject, which was exactly the sort of film she was looking for, and we have to invest a lot of money to get it in front of the right people. And it's not just as simple as a few Instagram posts and a poster here and there. You can lose that money very quickly. So in answer to your question, it's very difficult. But if you find them and show it to them, then they will come.
Just to back up what you're saying, Tom, as well, I think like something that we experienced on Name Me Lawand, this film we just finished, when we were, so BFI was our distributor, and something they said that was like unnerving but also quite exciting. They basically were like, we can do all the usual marketing things that any distributor is going to do, but basically like once the community of cyclists start talking about it, or so in our case, obviously the BFI were like, how do we reach the deaf community? Because if the deaf community feel like this film represents them in an authentic, true way, then they're all going to come see the film. And obviously that was that was like a moral goal for us. That was what Lawand wanted. Lawand was like, I want, you know, the deaf community to like know about this story, and the hearing community. But what was so cool was like the BFI were like, we can push it as much, you know, we'll do all the classic things that we all consider to be like, you know, film marketing. But basically with our film, the deaf community only, like the first sort of wave, like no one, you know, well, at least my friends in the deaf community and our deaf filmmakers, they were like, oh, I'm really surprised that not more, like, I thought the cinemas would just be full of the deaf community and no one's coming yet. And then like just something began that was like them just talking about it privately, basically. And then suddenly everyone was showing up, and then screenings like 3 weeks into the release, it suddenly felt like, oh, has someone organised this? Because there was so many people here from the deaf community, and then people were saying, oh no, we've already taken the film as our own. And that is, you know, obviously we just sort of ignored the marketing, but people just started seeing it and then talking about it. So that's quite comforting to know that you don't always need like a marketing machine in order to like reach the audience. But then it's also unnerving, because then however much marketing you get, sometimes it doesn't quite work, basically.
The dream is that you push the snowball just enough for it to keep going. The difficulty then is keeping the cinemas. If the film hasn't had a good first week or a good second week, then it can be gone before a lot of that audience that you were trying to snowball into have even realised that it was there in the first place.
But beforehand, you don't know if it's gonna work or not.
It's always in the hands of the gods. You can put all the money in the world in, you never know for sure if something's going to work or not. Or you can spend nothing and suddenly it clicks and it's great. So in answer to your question, nobody knows.
Exactly, yeah. We're giving bad advice, Tom. We're just like, there is no answer.
Yeah.
I have a quick question that's sort of linked to that, just out of curiosity. Would it be a thing that a filmmaker whose film hasn't been who's I mean, presumably when you come in as a distributor, it's just after the festival circuit, or fairly sort of you meet during that circuit or just after. Say a filmmaker approaches you. Does it ever happen that they approach you before they finished making the film to gauge your interest?
They might come to Dogworth in a sense, yeah, but not to me. I would be very far away from that conversation.
Okay. I was curious to see whether they would come up with maybe some niche subject, but they would have done the research to maybe back up the fact that there is an audience for it. I don't know if that's ever happened or that's a thing where they say,
no. We get pitched lots of films that are still sort of in that early development phase, and it might be a director or producer that we've worked with before, and so there's a sort of element of trust already in place.
And they would show, you know, I've been what's the word? Gauging interest in that community of people, and I can show that there is significant interest in that subject matter. Would you
that typically doesn't really happen. typically a director or producer has discovered a story that they really want to tell. It's down to us to sort of either say, yeah, there is an audience for that, or more often than not say, that sounds like a fantastic story, but where is that going to end up, that film? What's the home for that film? We can't say.
And then it's on them to then try and find a way to show that. Thank you, and thank you for the question. There was a question just behind you. Yes, thank you.
Hello. I know we're talking about documentary cinema in a cinema, but nobody's actually mentioned television yet. I mean, I know Ed mentioned Sky doing something for Sky Atlantic. Spoiler alert, I work for television. How important do you think television in this country is for documentary cinema? And do you think it's the enemy of documentary cinema, or do you think there's a way for television and the sort of films you're talking about can work together?
I mean, yeah, the word TV is a weird one, isn't it? Because obviously, so we're not like if I'm talking about like a 6-part thing on Netflix, are we including that in TV? No.
Talking broadcast.
Well, I'd call that TV.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, totally. Yeah. Because I was going to say, I don't know, like how many of us. My mum still does, but you know, like kind of look in the Radio Times and it's like, oh, that film's on at 6 p.m. on that channel. Whereas probably the rest of us are like, you know, being fed something or we're seeking it out on a streamer, aren't we? Basically, but I would consider that TV. Yeah, like a 6-part thing on. I would say the form of documentary in that more TV sense is what's kind of cool about it is it's given a load of documentary filmmakers a platform, so there's so much work out there, which is amazing. And also there's a load of stories that probably wouldn't get, think 10 years ago when it was only in cinemas, like how many documentaries were getting shown in cinemas, whereas now on Netflix there are all these gaps to fill, basically. So I think subjects are being shown more. Also with that, the enemy of documentary, there's a real, I think we all know, like there's new genres of like documentary in a way, isn't there? Like everyone knows what a Netflix documentary looks and feels like. Part of that's kind of good because when you go on there, you know exactly what you're getting, so you're never going to be thrown a curveball and be like, oh, the style of this film just didn't suit me, because it speaks the language of Netflix. It's like they all look quite similar. As like an artist, that's like not of interest to me, but I still watch some of those, and they kind of. So I think the new chapters of everything are at the beginning, and they're always considered like the enemy of the kind of like. But then stories are being shown more, basically, which I think is a good thing.
I think in terms of UK broadcasters, they're pretty crucial to the documentary ecosystem. Even in my role working in theatrical, we've sort of got some key revenue streams when we distribute a film, which is the theatrical box office, any grants that we get given, a home entertainment streaming revenue, and then potentially a sale to a UK broadcaster, Channel 4, BBC or Sky. And if they buy the film at a significant enough price, that justifies all the other things that we've done around the release of that film. We might lose money theatrically, but make it back on the sale to a broadcaster. So that allows that film to exist in the UK in the first place. And often that deal is done fairly early on in the process. And then it means that filmmaker has had their film released. They can move forward with confidence and make another film. And the whole thing just keeps feeding itself. We're probably on the verge of a sort of streamer boom coming to a bit of a close, documentary-wise, I think. We've sort of seen that coming over the last couple of years. About 10 years ago, it all sort of blew up quite a lot. Documentaries made up a sort of key pillar of Netflix and Amazon and that sort of thing. But the sort of feature-length documentary has sort of been algorithmed out of the streamers a little bit. And so we're maybe potentially going back to a similar situation to where we were about 10 years ago, where you've got big-ticket streamer documentaries being made with awards in mind. And probably a slightly more scrappy sort of independent scene happening underneath it, rather than the merging of the two that we've seen over the last 5 or 8 years, where some of the streamers were paying enormous amounts of money for documentaries that not many people ended up watching.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions, comments, reflections? Yes, back to you. Just there, sorry. Thank you.
I wanted to ask you said about streaming and everything. Where do you think the future of watching films in the cinema, both documentary and feature, is going in the next decade, like in the long term?
It's a very good question. It's very easy to read the sort of the trade headlines about Barbie and Oppenheimer and Top Gun rescuing the theatrical industry and rescuing cinemas. And that's sort of true to an extent. A lot of cinemas are still open, a lot of multiplexes are still open because Top Gun came out last year and Barbie came out this year. But a lot of that, underneath all of that, is the reality of a lot of documentaries don't do particularly well theatrically. And there are fewer and fewer places for documentaries to go. So we're sort of on the verge of a sort of reforming of the landscape a little bit, and the truth is we're kind of waiting to see how things turn out. Everything's a little bit in flux at the moment. The streamers aren't buying in quite the same way that they were. The broadcasting slots in the UK and in Europe are maybe fewer than they were. But people still want to see documentaries, and they don't necessarily want to see so-called documentaries about housewives and estate agents. They want to see feature-length stuff. So it will find a way. Hopefully the theatrical marketplace will begin to recover a little more, and we'll get more of that back. Back in 2019, there was a lot more theatrical happening. The pandemic really did a job on the whole theatrical marketplace, and documentary sort of suffered greatly because of that. But yeah, it's an interesting moment because things are changing right now, which is difficult.
Can I ask, if you had supreme power over the entire industry,
Wow.
what changes would you
Do
do
I not?
to kinda, yeah. What changes would you do to help in this direction?
It's such a big question. I think everyone in the room should answer that. You want films to be seen on a wider scale, on a broader level. A lot of cinemas in this country are very conservative with their programming. They don't support anything. The Garden Cinema being a very notable exception. Who are unbelievable amount of programming they do here. I don't know how they manage it, but the fact that there are so many multiplexes out there that just don't program anything at all, and there are very few provisions in place to allow sort of regional audiences, particularly to access things that they wouldn't have otherwise, because the economics of it just don't work. We would lose money if we tried to screen things in Odeons. We'd typically lose money on it. There are certain programs being brought in to try and encourage people to go to the cinema more, free screenings, that kind of thing. But I think there's probably a bit of a revolution needed into getting a broader range of programming into multiplex cinemas in particular, and some of the boutique cinemas, I'll be honest, who could be a bit braver with their programming as well. That's my 2 cents, but it's an enormous question. Have you got any thoughts on that? What would you do if you were in charge of everything?
If I had supreme power, that's dangerous. Like thinking about people being like braver with their programming, like View. Obviously, like nothing. You can't get more mainstream than like a View multiplex, and they obviously were like, we're not screening the film I made, and then people on Twitter like kicked up a storm about it and were like, well, I don't live next to an interesting cinema, so I can't see this film. Come on, View. And View like listened and then was like did a few test screenings, and then had like 2 nights where it was like 100 cinemas one night for like so there was like an idea to it, like one night only, 100 cinemas across the UK showing this film.
Yeah, we do that sometimes.
And that was obviously amazing. And then there was like a real that felt like a moment that people could talk about and say, talk about online and say, are you going in your city because I'm going in my city, kind of thing. And then that worked because they did it again 2 weeks later and showed it in 100 cinemas again. And I started to be like, oh, Twitter's quite interesting, how like back in the day you'd just be a random person kind of writing a letter to your cinema or something, but now that you can say it publicly, and also like it used to just be your name, but now obviously on Twitter someone's called film.news, and like no one, you don't know whether that's like a legit thing or not, but people are like, oh, okay, there's someone saying we need this film shown here. So it was interesting watching it and being like, oh, this is actually kind of cool. Like seeing that maybe View would reconsider their thoughts the next time they're offered like a relatively unique film. But I think the fact that basically all of the stuff that you were saying, Tom, is true, but I feel like we've come to a moment when 10 years ago my friends not in the film industry were not watching documentaries. You go to a multiplex, there's like Spider-Man versus any documentary, doesn't matter how big it is, you're going to go and see Spider-Man. Whereas like now people are like got really into watching documentaries. Obviously Netflix has helped that. So it's like people will proudly say like, I love documentaries, and that isn't considered like a niche thing now. So obviously the audience is there. So we just got to figure out how all of the films don't have to be about a famous person that everyone got to figure out how to get that bravery with.
Then it's about also having the cinemas kind of strongly believe that, and then show it in their programming, taking on more documentaries. So what would you, out of curiosity, what do you both think would be the extra step or kind of link between the two? What do you think is the most powerful thing that would get cinemas on board? Would it be purely the distributors? Would it be film critics? Would it be social media? Do any of these bear any weight more than the other?
A big critical reaction to a film can really transform its possibilities, but typically the major reviews for a film don't break until the week of release, so by that point the multiplexes are thinking much further ahead. I think it's very difficult to say to a View cinema, would you program this documentary 3 times a day for 7 days instead of a Denzel Washington film, because they're just not going to do that. So it's about finding economically viable ways of getting that film into those screens at the point of release, not 6 weeks later, but on the day of release, in a meaningful way, and them granting it some support. The studios give the cinemas a huge amount of money to send an email to their database saying, come and see Barbie this weekend. Whereas that's completely beyond our budget to do that with View. So they could potentially take a bit more of a staggered approach. But it's not really in their interest to do that. But there are some screening programs that are out there. So View and Odeon, they do try certain things. They don't work particularly well because I don't think they give them enough support. But going forward, they hopefully will start to see a bit more benefit to it. As theatrical, as cinema going just generally starts to creep back into people's lives. Because it did just disappear, and people are still coming back to it, and some are still reluctant to come back to it.
Yeah, and I was going to say also, I feel like it's a call to filmmakers and storytellers that if you can figure out a way of telling a story in a universal way, it will get to people. Basically, that's why, like, you know, maybe we're being a bit bleak up here, but anyone in the audience who's like, I want to get into documentary, or you know, like, obviously there is. It's up to us to make sure that we're not. I think documentary often is seen as this like unique thing and there's less sort of pressure compared to like a mainstream fiction movie. But I think it's up to like the storytellers to make sure that they're making stuff that is built for a cinema, as opposed to like a men documentary. It's a bit of a shame it doesn't get in a cinema. Like, I made Name Me Lawand specifically thinking this like won't work on a streamer, but I was like, this will look at a place on a phone on a streaming service, but this will feel right in a cinema, and then let's see what happens. But that was like my intention. So I think the more we do that, the more cinemas will take it. And then, like you're saying about the whole film critic thing, yeah, definitely. Like, sometimes it's just BFI was saying that same thing when they were marketing the film. They were like, hey, we can do everything we can do, but until like someone, like a person with an audience, starts talking about the film, that snowball won't begin, basically. So you need like a critic. Like, we had Commode who just loved the film, who then just like went mad for it, and then that sort of changed everything. So that you kind of need that help from those people, basically.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. We have more questions, gentleman there, and then I'll move on to you, I think. Yeah.
So I'm seeing filmmakers, a lot in the drama space, but a few in the documentary space as well, actually taking matters into their own hands and going down the self-distribution route, and, you know, kind of doing roadshows and events around, you know, smaller scale screenings. What do the panel think about that as a possible path for the independent documentarist?
I think if you can find a way to make it work, if you can, if you've got some so-called talent, as we call them, well, they are talented people, on board to sort of help and support, do Q&A screenings, that sort of thing, and you've got contacts at the cinemas, you can get them to buy in, programmers, then it makes perfect sense. But the costs are still very high. You still have to certify the film, you still have to provide an encoded DCP to every cinema that screens it, and the costs can rack up very, very quickly. If we did a Q&A tour of a film, the idea was always that tour would sort of pay for itself, but not enough people turned out. A good chunk of people did, but we essentially adopted a sort of self-releasing model. Let's try and break even on these sort of 2 weeks of previews.
Did it have a knock-on effect? Did it have added value when you got into, you know, other?
Not really, not particularly. But if you've got a sort of cool film that programmers can get into, that's kind of different from everything else on their program, then by all means go for it. It can work. It's happening more and more now.
Happens here at the Garden Cinema. We're very open to seeing independent films.
And for documentary, you've got Dockhouse
at
Bloomsbury, who are up for supporting anything and everything. They support me hugely. If it wasn't for them, we'd be in real trouble. But there are champions out there who will watch your films and program them. And you can be a lot more flexible than some of the distributors choose to be.
Yeah, they also provide, am I right in thinking Bertha Dockhouse also provides guidance and support for filmmakers?
I believe they do, yeah. No,
no,
they're an
it's,
independent entity, the Bertha Foundation, but they screen entirely within one screen at Curzon Bloomsbury.
In Bloomsbury, yeah. Thank you very much. And yes, just that second row. Thank you.
Ed, I just had a question about your process. You said that you spent 2 years. Then did you start? What were you then writing? Were you writing like the visual narrative that you were going to portray, or were you collaborating? Well, as you said, you were collaborating already. But that's basically my question.
Yeah. So for those 2 years, basically, yeah, I was sort of trying to figure out what the story was. Obviously, I think when you're making, the interesting thing about making documentaries, I guess, is that you've got the real life events in front of you, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there is a story there, if you know what I mean. You often, maybe Tom, maybe you got this experience as well, but people come and pitch you a really amazing subject and a person, and you're like, this is incredible, but unless that person basically is on like unless there's a drive to that person's life and it has to move from A to B.
Did you see Navalny, the film that it won the Oscar in the end? I mean, he's a huge notable figure to begin with, so that gives it a head start. But there's a moment halfway through the film where the plot really twists, and they didn't know that was going to happen when they started making the film. But there is actually a story being, it's actually a thriller of a story. And if you just pitch the idea of just a biography of this guy, that would be fairly interesting. But the fact that there's a narrative arc that occurs makes it's so much more interesting, because that rarely happens in documentary.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like this, like I was saying before, the sort of form of documentary, I think often like it happens less and less, I guess, because there's this like Netflix sort of pressure in a good way. When you watch a like Netflix film, it's like, they want their audience to know within 5 minutes there's going to be a load of narrative happening. But I think maybe 5 years ago I used to watch too many documentaries where I was like, this, no wonder I'm going to see Spider-Man over this, because there is no like there's no like narrative drive that is forcing you to stay in the cinema, basically, or you're rooting for a character and you're desperate to know what happens. So with me, I'm trying to figure out how to find that engine, basically, so that there's no point me making this film about Lawand and his family if everyone goes, it was interesting for the first 5 minutes, but I didn't bother watching it to the end. So obviously it's my job to make sure that they stay to the end, basically. So yeah, I spent 2 years being in these people's lives and kind of going, that was a really interesting moment. When we started shooting, I wonder if another moment like that might happen. And it's going to happen differently. I can't control how it happens, but that moment could provide us with some type of narrative beat. So I basically end up writing like a whole script that you're going to end up throwing away, but at least it kind of gives you some type of blueprint of like, we know we want to be here at this point because this might happen, basically. So and I do loads of audio interviews, so essentially my process is I always basically have like a radio play of the film, so there's no images, but it's just narration or conversations, and then I basically edit the film with like an editor for like, say 2 months, and then you basically finish the film with no visuals, and then you're like, cool, how do we visualize this story? So I've always done that. I'm doing that on this new film. But what was cool with Lawand, I was like, okay, cool. Well, there's going to be no audio interviews because he only communicates in sign. So his like voiceover is going to be in vision, him signing to camera. And I'm not really into films with like a headshot interview. I always think that sort of breaks the spell of a documentary, because then you kind of know the character ended up being fine at the end, or like here they are in a really like impersonal hotel room telling us about this really like dangerous situation they're in. So so that headshot thing I always think is bad news. But with Lawand, I was like, well, this is going to be the only way we're going to tell this story. So the first thing we shot basically was this master interview with him when he was like, here's my story, and then it was like, cool, now we've got the script, let's kind of come up with these ideas, work with Lawand, and basically be like, how do we visualize this story for you, basically. And yeah, also I guess with a fiction movie, you've got a script, you shoot it or you get in the edit, some stuff changes, but you're not like throwing stuff away. Whereas in documentary, often you get, everyone always says like you write a documentary in the edit. So that's something that I kind of am realizing more and more. You can like spend half your shooting budget on a whole thing only to get in the edit and be like, that can't be in the film anymore because we've now realized the prism of the storytelling device is over here, not over here. So but yeah,
sorry, but how did you shoot? Were you just constantly, did you have set days when you were going on and being like, oh, this is when we're going to film? Or were you like, oh, we'll try and take it more holistically and like pop in whilst you're in lessons or whilst you're getting taught?
Yeah, it was a bit of both. It was like there's, with all my films at the beginning, I shoot a collection of days that are just like verite days, basically, where we're not choreographing anything, we're just like witnessing nothing. What happens usually is you get like what I like to describe like the documentary middle. It's like a load of footage about interesting people going through something really extreme, but it's really boring to watch. Like nothing happens. Like I learned quickly when I was younger, I was like, wow, like you can be presented with someone going through the most extreme thing and you get rushes back and just go like everyone, like basically when people are going through something extreme, they're just sitting on their phones basically, or they're eating breakfast, and you kind of go, oh wow, this is so boring. But whenever I start a film, I just like to just get a load of hours with characters, so I just know like how they breathe and how they move and all these little things that in the end up in the edit. But at the beginning, it seems like it's sort of a lot of nothing basically. And then we kind of go back. So have you seen Name Me Lawand? Okay, so an example is in the film, there's this scene where his teacher, basically, there's this class and the teacher says to the class, right guys, there's an assignment and we're going to talk about what language means to you, and then we're going to come back in a couple of weeks and you're going to stand in front of the class and tell us in sign what language means to you. And so I saw all this happening and I thought it was really interesting, and when they came back, Lawand didn't go up and he didn't want to share his story basically. So the teacher was like, oh well, we're going to do another thing in about 3 months time. So I was like, cool, well let's redo it. And obviously I was just like, fingers crossed, Lawand is now going to have the bravery to on camera do the thing that he couldn't. Do you know what I mean? So it's about like being there and starting to write things down and be like, oh, I wonder if we were filming again in 6 months time, would that character have the bravery to do something else basically? So it ends up being a tiny bit more, when I say choreographed, it's more us like knowing where to put the camera but never interfering with anyone's authenticity. But there was a lot of like, so we'd walk into like a maths class and the DP would be like, the light's really rubbish in this room, and we'd be like, guys, can we just stop this maths class? Can everyone, do you mind switching with the geography class? And the teacher and the students were like, and by that point we were like 3 years in, they were like, okay, and then they just go and sit in a different classroom and carry on. So that was quite fun, but yeah.
Wow, that's an anecdote. Thank you. Thanks for the questions. Are we okay for time? Just checking. We tend to lose track of the hour when we're sat here. But 5 minutes? Oh, we've got a good couple of questions in there. Who wants to go next? Oh, there, hand in the middle of the room.
Have you always been so disciplined about not filming, not having a camera with you, and presumably there are some moments where you kind of think, oh, that was amazing, I really wish I'd got that on film, but I guess you feel like that's something you have to get past, that sort of desire to just constantly capture everything. You have to sort of take a step back. Did that come naturally to you, or was that something you had to work on a bit?
Yeah, the desire not to, yeah, I mean, I think I definitely learned that when I filmed so often and got nothing from it, basically, you know, like going back to that documentary middle thing, that I started to learn, yeah, that you're better off being brave and basically, you know, like this new film I'm making, when I was with the execs the other day and they were like, but you've got that on camera, right? And I was like, there's nothing on camera yet. So this story I'm telling you that's incredible, we haven't filmed any of it yet, so we're going to have to figure out how to film it again, or like film the next chapter of their life, and we are, you know. So, and I think, yeah, I made this, I think, yeah, it depends what it is as well, and what's like, and whether or not what you're shooting is interesting. I made this Katy Perry tour film a few years ago, which was just a a weird opportunity that just fell my way. And we were filming for like 2 years on that, thinking, wow, we're getting like 1,000 hours of nothing. And then got in the edit and found the engine of the story, and then looked back and was like, oh, there's actually a load of stuff here that's really interesting because we were maybe numb to it because we were turning up every day and filming. But I know, basically every like documentary filmmaker has like a different process. I think my process is like more stylized, maybe more choreographed. So like, so I've learned this. It's like worked for me, but it's definitely nerve-wracking. Definitely, being like, let's go and do another research trip without a camera and just hope that interesting things happen, but not the like pure gold, basically.
But you do audio interviews during that time, or you no recording at all? Or?
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. So I think I always do audio interviews, like mainly to try and avoid that feeling of like, oh, something great happened and we missed it, because then you are able to get it on audio. Also, I think I learned quite quickly, like, years back, that basically once people are on camera, obviously, I think something, for whatever reason, that I know I can do well is like getting people to be comfortable on camera. But I think it's shocking how more themselves they are with a microphone in front of them, but without a camera. Like, I've been with people and they've literally been like, because the camera isn't faced towards me, nothing's being recorded, but obviously there's a microphone right there and I've got a set of headphones on and we're getting all this story, and obviously audio interviews for me kind of make me feel like secure that I'm building this kind of like narrative. And then also my process is just that sort of radio play thing, so there's no pressure, and also it costs no money with me and a microphone, so I can just like do this for 2 years, write a whole story, and then really know that when you're spending all the money to get your DOP there and all the crew, you really know what you're getting, because you've already got this edit that people can watch and listen to, basically.
Thank you very much. Do we have one final question? Yes, in the middle as well. Thank you.
It's a question for Tom. Dogwoof have obviously been around for a little while. Just wondering how the company has evolved and grown over the last 10 years with the increased appetite for docs, and is the market quite competitive for you these days from other distributors?
I've worked at Dogwoof for 18 months, so I can't speak for the last 10 years, but it certainly feels like things are changing a little bit. So once upon a time, documentary-wise, Dogwoof would have been kind of the only show in town, but now there are a few other distributors who really specialise in documentary and have great success with it. There's just a much bigger appetite for documentary across the board, so other distributors have got involved. Certainly from a sort of global point of view, it's much harder to make sales in the US than it was a few years back. The broadcast deals are getting harder to find. So we're now at Dogwoof looking into developing and producing our own films and sort of bringing things to market that way, because it can lead to just a much more all-round holistic success, to have a sort of what you might call a vertically integrated operation. So in the past we've always acquired films externally, but now we're working very, very hard to sort of bring things in-house and let people bring their ideas to us, and we can sort of invest money in developing and producing them, because that just seems to be the safest way to proceed. If that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much to you all, to our members who've come here for this session about documentary filmmaking. Thank you to both our guests. Big round of applause.
Thanks, everyone.
For sharing all that with us. Thank you.